Millions tuned in expecting a calm morning interview, a familiar couch, a reassuring smile, safe questions. But what unfolded live on national television wasn't a conversation. It was a slow collision. By the time Prince Harry pushed his chair back, the studio wasn't breathing, and George Stephanopoulos knew something had just gone very, very wrong. The Good Morning America studio had perfected the art of comfort, warm lights, neutral tones, a skyline that softened New York into something gentle and distant, the kind of set designed to lower defenses, to make even the most complicated stories feel manageable before breakfast. Prince Harry sat on the left side of the curved desk, shoulders squared, hands loosely clasped, navy suit, open collar, the carefully rehearsed posture of a man who wanted to appear relaxed without ever quite being so. Across from him, George Stephanopoulos listened quietly, fingers resting on a stack of notes he hadn't touched yet. His expression was polite, practiced, and deliberately unreadable. Around them, the panel smiled, nods, soft laughter at the opening pleasantries. The audience at home saw what they always saw: another high-profile guest, another controlled interview. But the tension was already there, subtle, almost invisible. It showed in the way Harry's jaw tightened when George thanked him for coming on, in the half-second pause before Harry answered the first question, in the way his eyes flicked briefly to the cameras, then back. George began exactly where everyone expected. "So, Prince Harry, or Harry if you prefer, thank you for being here. I know mornings aren't always easy." A light chuckle rippled through the studio. Harry smiled. It was polite, measured. "Happy to be here," he said. "It's good to talk." George nodded. "Your book has sparked a lot of conversation, a lot of emotion, and you've said this is about telling your truth." Harry leaned forward slightly. "That's right. It's about honesty, about finally being heard." The word finally landed harder than it needed to. George noticed. He always noticed. "And," George continued evenly, "you've also said this isn't about attacking your family." Harry's smile thinned. "Correct. But," George added gently, "many viewers feel that some of the revelations feel deeply personal, even painful." Harry shifted in his seat. "I think what people find uncomfortable," he said, voice calm but firm, "is accountability." The panel exchanged quick glances, still calm, still safe. George didn't push, not yet. Instead, he pivoted, a classic Stephanopoulos move. "You've spoken a lot about the media," he said, "about how coverage shaped your life from a young age, how it shaped your marriage." Harry nodded immediately. This was familiar ground. "The media created a narrative," Harry said, "and it didn't stop. It never stops." George inclined his head. "And yet, you've chosen to speak, repeatedly, through major platforms." The word repeatedly slipped in unnoticed by most. Harry caught it. "There's a difference between telling your story and being hunted," he replied. George's tone stayed soft. "Of course, but some critics would say," Harry cut in, just slightly, "critics aren't living my life." The interruption was brief, almost nothing, but George paused, not to challenge, to let the moment breathe. The studio air shifted. "I understand that," George said calmly. "But when you describe private conversations, private moments—" "They were weaponized against me first," Harry snapped back, sharper than before. A beat. Harry realized he'd raised his voice. He exhaled, forced a reset. "Sorry," he said quickly. "It's just exhausting." George nodded sympathetically. "I can imagine." He turned a page on his notes, slowly, deliberately. "And yet," he said, "your family hasn't responded in kind." Harry's eyes hardened. "They don't need to," he said. "They have the institution." There it was. The word hung between them. Institution. George didn't smile this time. "And you have the microphone," George replied. The silence that followed wasn't long, but it was loud. Harry leaned back, crossing his arms now, defensive, guarded. "I didn't ask for this," he said. "I didn't ask to be born into that system." George met his gaze steadily. "No one's suggesting you did." Then, gently, "But you are choosing how you leave it." The panel stopped smiling. Harry laughed, once, short, humorless. "That's an interesting way to put it." George didn't flinch. Is it inaccurate? Harry's fingers tightened against his sleeve. I think, he said slowly, there's a tendency to reduce my experiences into sound bites that are comfortable for everyone else. George nodded. That's television. Harry stared at him. So is this, Harry said quietly. The words were calm, but they carried weight. George leaned back slightly, folding his hands. Let's talk about responsibility. Harry's expression changed. Not anger, not yet, but something colder. Whose? He asked. George didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked directly into the camera for a brief moment, a subtle signal to the audience. Everyone's, he said, including yours. The studio lights felt brighter now. Harry's leg bounced once under the desk. He smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. All right, he said, let's do that. And somewhere off camera, a producer felt a quiet knot tighten in their stomach, because the interview had just crossed an invisible line, and there was no going back. George didn't rush. He let Harry's last sentence sit there. Let's do that, as if it were agreement, not a challenge. The camera pushed in slightly, tightening the frame. The set still looked warm, but the air in it wasn't. Responsibility, George repeated, almost gently. You've asked for accountability from the institution, from the press, from people around you. So, let me ask this plainly. What responsibility do you take for the damage this has caused? Harry's smile stayed on his face the way a sticker stays on glass. It didn't move. You're assuming damage, he said. George nodded once. I'm acknowledging impact. Families, yours included, are watching. People you've named or described, your brother, your father. Harry's jaw tightened. You mean the people who had an army of advisors writing statements about me for years? George's tone stayed even. And you're responding with a book, interviews, a documentary, more interviews. Harry leaned forward. Because nobody listened when I was silent. George held his gaze. And when you speak, you're asking the public to accept your version as truth. Harry blinked, slow. It is my truth. There it was again. The phrase sounded like a shield. George's eyes dropped to his notes for the first time. Not because he needed them, because it signaled the next level. Okay, George said. Let's take one specific claim then. You've talked about private conversations, moments you say shaped you. Critics say, if you want privacy, why reveal private details? Harry's breath came out through his nose, controlled, almost a laugh. Privacy, he said, isn't the same as secrecy. George didn't react. Explain the difference. Harry's eyes flicked toward the panel, like he was checking for support, then back to George. Privacy is a boundary, Harry said. Secrecy is what institutions demand so they can continue behaving without consequences. George tilted his head. So, naming people is consequences. Harry's voice sharpened. It's reality. The panelists nearest George shifted in their chair. A coffee mug clinked lightly against the glass desk. Accidental, small, but loud in the tension. George didn't look away. You said you didn't want to attack your family, he said, but you've described events that paint them in a very specific light. Let me ask, did you consider how your children will read this one day? Harry's eyebrows rose. My children will read that their father didn't stay quiet while he was being destroyed. George's expression stayed neutral. Destroyed by whom? Harry stared. By the machine. George's mouth tightened at the corners. Not anger, something like fatigue. And yet, George said, you stepped away. You moved to California. You built a new life. Harry nodded quickly. Yes. So why? George asked. Does it still seem like you're fighting the same war every week on every platform? Harry's eyes hardened again. The smile was gone now. Because they didn't stop, he said. Because they kept coming. George nodded slowly. The press? Harry leaned in. And people like you. The studio froze. George didn't flinch. But the panel did. The energy changed instantly. The way a room changes when someone breaks the social contract. People like me, George repeated, calm. Harry's lips pressed together. People who sit behind a desk and pretend they're being fair while repeating the same insinuations. George's voice stayed measured, but a degree cooler. I'm asking questions, Harry. Harry shrugged, exaggeratedly casual. That's what you call it. George held his gaze. And what do you call it? Harry's eyes narrowed. A performance. George's jaw flexed once. He didn't speak for a second. The pause was deliberate, control returning to the host. All right, George said at last, quietly. Then let's drop the performance. Harry sat back. Gladly. George's fingers tapped the papers once. One soft click. In your earlier interviews, George continued, you said there were briefings, information planted about you, that the institution fed stories to protect others. Harry nodded, firm. Yes. George. Do you have proof? Harry didn't blink. I lived it. George didn't let it go. That's not proof. That's experience. Proof would be documentation, messages, emails, names. Harry's nostrils flared slightly. You want me to expose private sources? George's reply was quiet, almost surgical. You already exposed private people. Harry's head turned a fraction, like he'd been slapped, just enough to show the hit landed. You're being... Harry started. George cut in, still calm. Specific. Harry's laugh came out louder this time. No, you're being clever. George nodded as if accepting the label. Maybe, but the question remains. Harry stared at George for a long second, then leaned forward again, fingers steepled on the desk like he was about to deliver something rehearsed. I don't need to satisfy your checklist, he said. The public has eyes. They've watched this happen. George's voice didn't rise. The public also watched you sign contracts for media deals. Harry snapped. And what? That means I'm not allowed to talk? George's tone sharpened slightly, finally showing the edge. It means some people think this isn't just about healing. It's about profit. Harry's face changed, fast. The polite guest disappeared. The prince arrived. You're implying I'm exploiting my pain, Harry said, low and controlled. George nodded once. I'm asking if you've considered that perception. Harry leaned in, eyes locked. And I'm telling you, it's disgusting. The panelists nearest Harry opened their mouth, maybe to soften it, but George lifted one hand slightly, stopping them. He didn't want help. He wanted clarity. Disgusting, George repeated. Harry. Yes, George. So the public can't question motives? Harry's voice rose just a notch. Not when they haven't lived it. George's eyes didn't move. That's convenient. Harry's hand spread in a sharp gesture, palms up. See? This is what I mean. Convenient? Harry echoed. You're doing it right now. You're making me the problem instead of the system. George leaned forward a little too, matching Harry's posture. Harry, he said, you're not a powerless teenager anymore. You're a grown man with a global megaphone. At what point does it become your responsibility to stop fueling the fire? Harry's face tightened. His voice came out clipped. At what point, Harry shot back, does it become your responsibility to stop pretending you're neutral? There was a beat where both men held eye contact and no one breathed. Then George did something subtle. He stopped looking like a host and started looking like a prosecutor. All right, George said quietly. Then let's talk about what you've asked the world to believe. Harry's chin lifted. Go on. George turned a page. Because the next question, George said, is the one you keep dodging. Harry's eyes narrowed. What question? He asked. George looked up from the paper, straight into Harry's face. Why, he said, does every story still end with you as the victim, no matter who gets hurt along the way? Harry's mouth opened. No sound came out at first, and in the silence, the entire set seemed to tilt, just slightly, towards something neither of them could control anymore. For the first time since the interview began, Harry didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched, not the comfortable kind, the kind producers hate, the kind that makes viewers lean closer to the screen without realizing it. George didn't fill it. He waited. Harry finally inhaled, slow and deliberate, as if measuring how much control he still had left. You keep framing this like a pattern, Harry said at last. Like I'm some kind of recurring character in a story you've already decided on. George's reply was immediate. I'm asking why the pattern exists. Harry shook his head. No, you're insisting it exists. George folded his hands. Then break it. Harry let out a short, sharp laugh. You want an example? George nodded once. Yes. Harry leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. The posture was defensive, Unmistakably so. Fine, Harry said. Let's talk about Afghanistan. The room shifted again. This wasn't where anyone expected him to go. George didn't interrupt, but his eyes sharpened. You wrote about your time there, George said carefully. Yes. Harry nodded. And suddenly I was told I'd put people at risk, that I was reckless, that I'd crossed the line. George, those were legitimate concerns raised by military analysts. Harry snapped back, raised by people who were never there. George's tone stayed controlled. You described combat in a way some felt was simplified. Harry leaned forward. You think I simplified war? George didn't rise to it. I think you simplified responsibility. Harry's jaw tightened again. You keep saying that word, he said. Responsibility, but you never say whose. George didn't hesitate. Yours? Harry stared at him. And theirs, George added, gesturing vaguely. The institution, the press, the monarchy, the system Harry kept naming. But the difference, George continued, is that they aren't sitting here right now. Harry's voice dropped. Convenient. George nodded slightly. Yes, for you. That landed harder than the others. One of the panelists shifted, clearly uncomfortable now. Another glanced off camera, likely toward the producers. Harry leaned forward again, both hands on the desk. You invited me here, he said. You asked me to speak. George met his gaze. I asked you to answer. Harry's eyes flashed. I am answering. George shook his head once. You're redirecting. Harry's voice rose, not loud, but sharp. Because your questions aren't neutral. George's tone cooled further. Neither are your stories. The temperature dropped. Harry exhaled slowly, nostrils flaring. You know what this is? Harry said. This is the same thing. Smiling skepticism, plausible deniability. George's reply was immediate. No, this is scrutiny. Harry scoffed. From a comedian. A murmur rippled through the studio. George's eyes narrowed, not angrily, but decisively. Careful, he said. Harry leaned back, spreading his hands. Why, that's what you are. George nodded. And you came on my show. Harry shot back. I came on this show thinking it was a conversation. George's voice hardened. It is. Just not a monologue. Harry laughed again, louder this time, shaking his head. There it is, Harry said. That tone, that gotcha energy. George didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You're deflecting again, he said. Every time the question moves toward your choices, you pull it back to your pain. Harry's face flushed slightly. My pain isn't a tactic, he said. It's reality. George replied evenly. Pain doesn't exempt you from accountability. Harry slapped the desk lightly, just once, enough to be heard. That's easy for you to say, Harry snapped. You didn't grow up being dissected. George leaned forward now, finally matching Harry's intensity. No, George said, but I grew up learning that explaining yourself forever doesn't heal you. It traps you. Harry's mouth opened, then closed again. George pressed on. You left, George said. You won your freedom. You got the platform. So tell me, honestly, what keeps you here? Harry stared at him. I'm here, Harry said slowly, because people keep lying about me. George didn't miss a beat. Then why keep giving them new material? Harry's voice rose again. Because silence didn't work, George replied, sharp but calm. Neither is this. The words hung between them like a verdict. Harry's hands curled into fists on the desk. You don't get to decide what works for me, Harry said. George nodded. No, but the public does. Harry leaned back, shaking his head in disbelief. So, this is a trial now? He asked. You're the judge? George's expression didn't change. No. He paused. I'm the mirror. That did it. Harry pushed his chair back slightly, not standing yet, but the intention was suddenly there. This is exactly why I don't do these interviews anymore, Harry said. George raised an eyebrow. You've done quite a few. Harry shot him a glare. And every time, it's the same. George responded calmly. Then why come? Harry opened his mouth, closed it, looked down at the desk, at the Daily Show mug, at the book lying beside George's notes. Then he looked up again, eyes hard. Because I thought you'd be different, Harry said. George didn't soften. I am. Harry's voice turned icy. No, you're just better at hiding it. The panelist closest to Harry leaned in, trying to intervene. Maybe we should... Harry cut them off without looking. No, he said. Let him finish. George studied Harry for a long moment. All right, George said. Here's the part you won't like. Harry's lips pressed together. You can talk about trauma, George continued. You can criticize institutions, but when every chapter, every interview, every story positions you as the only one telling the truth, people stop listening, not because they hate you, because they feel manipulated. Harry stood up. The chair scraped audibly against the floor. There it is, Harry said. That's enough. George didn't stand. He didn't shout. You're walking away, George said, instead of answering. Harry looked down at him. I'm walking away from bad faith. George replied quietly, You're walking away from discomfort. Harry turned toward the exit, then paused, just long enough to look back. You wanted honesty? Harry said. Here it is. The studio went completely still. I'm done explaining myself to people who profit from doubt. Then he took a step. The camera followed. George watched him go, expression unreadable. Harry, George said, not calling him back, not stopping him, just saying the name. Harry stopped, turned halfway. George's voice was calm, almost regretful. This was your chance to change the story. Harry looked at him for a long second. Then he said, quietly but clearly, I already did. And he walked off. The camera stayed on the empty chair. The tension didn't leave with him. George turned back to the desk slowly, exhaled once, and looked straight into the camera. Well, he said, that answers one question. The red recording light stayed on, and everyone knew the fallout hadn't even started yet. Harry's footsteps faded down the corridor, but the silence he left behind stayed. For a full 3 seconds, no one spoke. The empty chair sat slightly crooked, one leg no longer aligned with the desk, a small but telling detail. The kind directors usually cut away from. George Stephanopoulos didn't look at it. He looked straight into the camera, not with triumph, not with smugness, with something closer to exhaustion. Well, George said quietly, adjusting the papers in front of him without really reading them. That was, unexpected. One of the panelists shifted uncomfortably. Another tried to smile. Failed. George raised a hand, gently stopping any attempt to fill the space with chatter. No, he said. Let's not rush past this. The control room hesitated. This wasn't in the rundown. George leaned forward slightly. When a guest walks off, he continued, it's easy to frame it as drama, as a viral moment, a headline. He paused. But sometimes it's a conclusion. The camera slowly pushed in. This interview was never meant to corner Prince Harry, George said. It was meant to understand him. He glanced briefly toward the empty chair, but understanding requires staying in the room. The words landed softly, harder than any accusation. George turned back to the panel. We ask questions many viewers have asked for years, he said, about responsibility, about repetition, about whether telling your story can eventually become a prison instead of a release. A producer's voice crackled faintly in his earpiece. George ignored it. When someone leaves instead of answering, George continued, the story changes, but not always the way they expect. The panelist closest to him spoke carefully. Do you think he planned to leave? George shook his head. No. Another panelist asked, then why did he? George didn't answer immediately. Because, he said finally, the hardest moment in any conversation is the one where you realize the questions aren't going away. He folded his hands. And neither is the public. After the commercial break, George returned alone. No panel, no distractions, just him and the camera. I want to be clear, he said. Prince Harry is welcome back on this program anytime. He paused. But conversations only work when both sides are willing to finish them. He looked directly into the lens. That's not a criticism. It's a reality. The director signaled time. George nodded once. And that, he said calmly, is where we'll leave it. The broadcast ended, but the moment didn't. If you want more high-tension behind-the-scenes stories like this, real conversations, real conflicts, and the moments that change everything, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Because sometimes the most powerful part of a story is who chooses to walk away.